afternoon, everyone. So I think we'll just get started and everyone can just roll in. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Anab Ibrahim Oluso. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a professional development associate at the Ontario Association of Social Workers. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you to Advancing Equity in Program Evaluation. Before we begin, we will start with the land acknowledgement. I want to begin this webinar by acknowledging that a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous people as traditional stewards of this land and the lasting relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. We take this opportunity to acknowledge that we are each participating in this meeting from diverse traditional territories. I would like to acknowledge my work takes place on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Nishabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As we acknowledge this land, we acknowledge colonialism as an ongoing process, and we must practice mindfulness in our participation. We must also recognize the historical impact of multi-generational effects of colonization, broken treaties, oppressive laws, enslavement, anti-Black racism that have occurred. This acknowledgement is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose land we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land, and to seek to learn and understand our place within that history. Along with this, we acknowledge our collective responsibilities and solidarity to restore our commitment to support action. At OSW, we are prioritizing equity integration. And as a part of this work, it's also important to acknowledge Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation, and marginalization, as it's had a devastating impact on the people of African descent. The existence of systematic anti-Black racism and inequality in education, housing, employment, health, criminal justice, politics, and other areas can be directly traced to the complex legacy of the dehumanizing enslavement of African people in Canada. Canada has neither recognized nor educated the public adequately about the historical facts related to slavery and anti-Black racism it has produced. Despite this, Black Canadians have made outstanding contributions to Canada in every field, which is all more remarkable given the legacy of slavery. It is necessary to recognize the history of Black Canadians in order to build a more just society free from discrimination. We have a few housekeeping reminders. All participants will be on mute during the webinar. Please use the Q&A function button to submit your questions to our faculty. If we have ensured and tested all our tech requirements to the best of our ability, we will be unable to troubleshoot individual issues today. To limit interruption to the sound and picture, we suggest that you close other applications on your device for the duration of the webinar. Please note, the webinar will be available on demand in the next few weeks. The PowerPoint slides and additional resources shared in this webinar will be shared in a follow-up email. Lastly, you will receive a brief survey following this training. Please take a moment to complete the survey so that we can learn more about your learning interests and goals. The Ontario Association of Social Workers, OSW, is committed to creating events and communities that are free of harassment, where all participants share a commitment to supporting a culture of respect and intentional engagement. As a participant, we encourage you to be thoughtful and kind in your communication and acknowledge others' identities, backgrounds, histories, and lived experiences. This includes being respectful when asking questions and engaging in discussions, actively contributing to upholding a welcoming and inclusive space for all. By engaging in an event or community hosted by OSW, we ask that you agree to uphold the points highlighted here. If any participants are not following these points, OSW staff will connect with them about how to contribute to a welcoming space. I also want to highlight some of our upcoming webinars. Thriving During Change is being offered on Wednesday, August 17th from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m., as well as Decolonizing Research on Monday, August 22nd from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. If you haven't registered already, we encourage you to do so at osc.osw.org. Now, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce our faculties, Caroline Hummel and Khadija Khanji. Caroline, pronouns she and her, is a research assistant at YouthREX. She received her Master's of Science in Kinesiology and Health Studies from Queen's University and is currently pursuing a doctorate in Applied Health Sciences at Brock University. with a focus on program evaluation and positive youth development in the sport and recreation sector. Outside of her studies, she works as an external evaluation consultant for provincial and national sport organization, serves on the board of directors for BGC Sarnia Lambton, and volunteers with various local youth-serving organizations. We also have here Khadija, pronouns she and her, who's an evaluation associate at YouthREX. Khadija also works for an Islamic educational center where she focuses on anti-Islamophobia education and activism, and is a clinical supervisor and individual and group therapist working with immigrant women and 2S LGBTQ plus BIPOC community. Khadija writes and speaks regularly on the issues of race, gender, and sexuality. And I did forget to mention her pronouns, which are she and her. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. I will now let Caroline and Khadija get us started.
All right, thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. All right, can I get a thumbs up that we're good? We see it, Khadija? Thank you. All right, it is an absolute pleasure to be here presenting a little bit about program evaluation and some ways to advance equity in evaluation with you all today. And I'm not going to go through these introductions just because I think Anab did such a wonderful job capturing a little bit about Khadija and myself. So just for sake of not repeating anything, we will get right into YouthREX's land acknowledgement because we here at YouthREX also want to acknowledge the land that we are currently situated on. So for YouthREX, our provincial office is located at York University, which occupies the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wendat, and the Métis, and it's now home to many Indigenous peoples. And we acknowledge the current treaty holders and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Walk with Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. And because this is a virtual event, of course, I encourage all of you to take a moment to reflect on the territories of which you currently reside, to honor Indigenous peoples of these lands, both historically and presently. So here is our agenda for today. I'm going to open up with a quick introduction into YouthREX and some of the things that we do as an organization. Next, I'll be leading the first part of this webinar, which is focusing all around program development and evaluation. We'll take a quick break, and then I'll pass it over to my awesome colleague, Khadija, who will cover the second part of this webinar, which is all about advancing equity and evaluation. After that, we'll wrap up with some resources to help with your continued learning, and then open the floor up to any questions or comments. So here at YouthREX, our vision is an Ontario where shared knowledge is transformed into positive impact for all youth. And we aim to accomplish this by making research evidence and evaluation accessible and relevant to Ontario's youth sector. And the way that we do this is through three main streams. First, we have our knowledge exchange. So our knowledge exchange team works really hard to curate a ton of amazing resources for our Knowledge Hub to help stakeholders like yourselves increase their learnings around evaluation. And examples of some of these knowledge products that we have on our Knowledge Hub include things like infographics, evidence briefs, research summaries, and a lot of audio and visual content as well. So I highly recommend that after this webinar, you take a moment to check out our Knowledge Hub because you may find some resources that will really help you. We also enhance capacity building through events such as this webinar. We also offer interactive workshops as well as online certificate programs such as our program evaluation for youth wellbeing certificate. And finally, Khadija and I are part of our research and evaluation team, and we provide customized evaluation support for Ontario youth stakeholders. As mentioned at the beginning, I will be going through the first part of our webinar here, which is all about program development and evaluation. But just to get things started, I want to present YouthREX's framework for evaluating youth well-being. So this framework is a step-by-step guide for evaluating youth programs, and it's focusing on using these evaluation findings to promote the well-being of youth participants. And as you can see on the screen, it's made up of 3 phases, which are color-coded, divided into 7 steps. And while this framework is described in terms of these steps, just want to point out that evaluation processes are not linear in nature and may need to be completed in a back and forth effort. And then of course too, depending upon where you are as an organization in the evaluation process, not everyone will be starting at step one. For instance, if you've already collected your data and you're ready to analyze it, you may be starting right at step 5. It just depends upon where you are. And just to get our minds moving a little bit, I want to hear from all of you. So when you hear that term program development, what comes to mind? What do you think of? We have a poll that will be launched that provides a few options. And of course, if the options don't resonate with you, you can select other. Really just want to get a feel for how people view program development. So we want to go ahead. There we go. I see it. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so it looks like designing something new or relevant is what a lot of people said, consultations with different stakeholders for sure. And just as a side note, all of these things count under program development. But when we think about program development, one thing that I like to think of is the analogy of Lego or pizza. So program development is when you take these, individual pieces, and these individual pieces in terms of evaluation would be our assets. So time, money, human resources, expertise. We take these individual things and we combine it all together to make something that is greater than the sum of all its parts. And really, that's kind of what program evaluation or program development, is about. It's that process of conceptualizing the need for, envisioning, and determining the scope and logistics of a program. And essentially, program development is any activity you do to build your program. And it's important to note that this building is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing pursuit because we have to routinely consider and revise our programming based upon response to evaluation finding activities so that our program is best fulfilling the needs of our program participants through the latest data. And when developing a program, there are certain steps that we can take and certain steps that we actually recommend organizations take to accomplish this, which can be seen on the screen here. And before you even design your program, you must first recognize that there's a gap that exists that warrants the creation of said program. And this can be accomplished through a variety of different ways, such as conducting needs assessments or doing literature reviews. You may also opt for community consultations where you go directly into your community of interest and ask them what they're noticing and what they would like. Either way, once you've determined that there is a gap and some strategies to help fill this gap, you're ready to start designing your program and its intended objectives and outcomes. And here are some factors that really tell us that a program is of high quality, starting off with a strong program design. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this in the next slide. Next, there's an evidence base for your activities. High quality programs also have quality staff. So staff are well trained, they're adequately prepared, they feel ready to deliver the programming. High quality programs involve program monitoring, evaluation, and improvement. And this next one is not as important, but certainly helps, and that's the development of effective partnerships. And then this last one is very important, and that is intentional program delivery. So everything that you're doing with your program is doing it with a purpose. So I really want to focus in on strong program design here, just because, again, this is the first part of program development. And having a strong program design essentially means that there's clear alignment between your program components, such as your activities, and your intended outcomes. And without this alignment, your program purpose can get lost, and we certainly don't want that. So to help with this, you can do the following things. First, think of those desired program outcomes. Next, design your activities to meet these outcomes. And finally, ensure that the chosen activities are grounded with an evidence base. And this is important because we want to make sure that the activities that we're doing, again, are going to lead to those outcomes. So while you may have these like really awesome, great, fun activities, if they don't help you reach those outcomes, they're probably activities that you don't want to include in your program. Ultimately, you want to ask yourself, why are we doing this? And how does this align with our program outcomes or goals? Well, what's a way that we can kind of keep accountable for this? Well, you can use a logic model. So a logic model is defined as a picture of how your program works. the theory and assumptions that are underlying it, in other words. And the model provides essentially a roadmap of your program because it highlights how it's expected to work, what activities need to come before others, and how desired outcomes are achieved. More specifically, logic models aim to accomplish the following objectives. Firstly, they summarize those key elements of your program. So for instance, what are those main activities involved? They also explain the rationale behind program activities, and this can be done through that evidence base. You're providing rationale behind why you think that these activities will lead to those outcomes. They describe the link between activities and outcomes. They provide an opportunity for stakeholders to discuss the program and agree on its description and intended results. And finally, they serve as a way to improve communication about your program to others. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you have come across logic models already. They're something that a lot of funders ask for, particularly when you're going throughout the application process for funding opportunities, because again, they provide just that overall picture of your program in a very clear visual way to other parties. And here is a logic model template that we actually use here at YouthREX. So our inputs, these are what we invest into our program. This can include things like time, money, technology, even human resources count as inputs. Next, we have outputs, which are what we do in our program, so our activities, paired with who we reach through the program, so the actual participants. And finally, our outcomes are a result of your inputs and outputs, and these things happen over time. So we have them divided into short, medium, and long-term outcomes. Short-term outcomes are usually changes that we see achieved within 6 to 12 months post-program. Medium are around 1 to 2 years post-program, and anything over 3 years would count as long-term outcomes. And when focusing on your program's outcomes in particular, you must always indicate the change of direction that's occurring. It's not enough just to say that a change happened. And this is one of the biggest things that I come across through my consulting work, is that people have really great outcomes, but they're not specific enough. So if you're trying to say that there was an increase and a change, you could use terminology such as increased, raised, enlarged, expanded, or improved. And then vice versa, if you want to say there's a decrease, you could say lowered, shortened, reduced, prevented. Main takeaway here is you must be indicating that change in direction for it to be a strong outcome. And when looking at short-term outcomes in particular, your goals should be arranged in SMART format, meaning they're smart or specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And short-term outcomes also typically assess changes in things like knowledge and awareness. So this is something to take in consideration when thinking of your outcomes. Now, when we're thinking about changes in behavior, this is where we would see happening in our medium to long-term outcomes, because we know that behavior change is not an immediate thing. So when going through differentiating between those different types of outcomes, again, short-term would be more so those changes in what's listed in the orange box, whereas medium and long-term are more of the behavioral changes that we would see. And just to summarize, logic models are beneficial for a variety of reasons. Firstly, they build consensus and clarity among staff and other stakeholders about the essential program activities and expected outcomes. Next, they identify opportunities for program improvement. They spell out the beliefs and assumptions that underlie your choice of activities and intended outcomes. They assess your program's likelihood of success and identify factors that could impact the success. And finally, they increase your understanding of program performance by clarifying the sequence of events from inputs through outputs through outcomes. All right, now we are going to transition into talking about program evaluation. And I have another poll question for you all. So previously I asked you what you thought about when it came to program development. Now I'm curious what people think when we hear program evaluation. So take a few moments to leave your response via the poll. Okay, I think we are good to end the poll here and share the findings. Yeah, so a lot of people said all of the above. It can include things like measurement and assessment, learning exploration, improvements for the future. And of course, we know meeting those funding requirements is definitely a big part of program evaluation, absolutely. But before going into exactly what program evaluation is, it's important to touch upon what program evaluation is not. Firstly, program evaluation is not an assessment of individual staff performance. So the purpose of it is to gain an overall understanding of your functioning of a program, not the individual people in that program. Program evaluation is not an audit. So this means that evaluation does not focus on compliance with laws and regulations. It is not research. Evaluation is a pragmatic way to learn about a program that's specific to that program or that context that the program's operating in. The goal of evaluation is not to add to a generalizable knowledge base. And finally, program evaluation is not a single method. It can involve a range of different techniques for gathering information to answer those questions about a program. Now, what is program evaluation? Well, it's that systematic set of activities carried out towards understanding how, why, and to what extent a program is achieving its outcomes towards improving the well-being of young people. An evaluation provides programs with the tools to understand, measure, and track if their programs achieve their intended outcomes and impacts. But equally important, it allows us to understand how our program was successful, as well as how it can be improved for the future. Essentially, key concept around evaluation is it allows you to do what you do better through measuring outcomes and looking at the process. So program development, just to kind of like recap the difference between the two. Program development, I like to conceptualize as the before. So it's this process of that envisioning and determining the scope and logistics of a program, whereas program evaluation is the during or after. So it's that process of determining the success based upon these predetermined metrics of your program. So I just wanted to provide a quick little differentiation between the two. And there are various types of evaluations out there, but the two main ones are process and outcome. So starting off with process evaluations. These are an ongoing process that allow programs to build in feedback during a program cycle. So they concentrate on examining changing processes as they occur, and they provide timely feedback about program services while allowing you to make program adjustments, quote unquote, on the fly to help achieve your program goals. Now, outcome evaluations typically occur at the end of your program, and they provide an overall picture of your program effectiveness while examining program outcomes to determine that overall program effectiveness. And when thinking about the evaluation process as a whole, here are the common components that one typically goes through when conducting an evaluation. So after you've developed that logic model, what you'll want to do is determine those specific questions that you want answered through your evaluation. And when developing your questions, you want to determine the most meaningful evaluation questions to ask. And we do this because it will guide our decisions behind the most appropriate evaluation design to implement so that we're better able to produce the most valid and reliable data that will be used to answer those questions. And I'm just going to quickly go through some examples of both process and outcome evaluation questions. So to remind you, process evaluations are focused on the ongoing aspects of a program. So for example, questions could be, what is our program's reach? Are participants satisfied with their experience in the program? Were there any barriers to program implementation? Now, outcome evaluation questions should be more focused on changes experienced post-program, and these will be more specific to the context of your program. So for instance, I have two areas here as an example that could relate to different programs: social relationships and education. So under social relationships, maybe a question is, how does the program contribute to the development of relationships or social bonds for youth? Overall, without evaluation, you could be running on the spot and never reaching your destination. Evaluation is important for a variety of reasons, but it's really crucial for things like ensuring resources are used appropriately, mitigating unintentional harm, modeling successes or sharing learnings from failures, and generating support through things like funding streams. In summary, what I hope you take away from this first part of the webinar is that evaluation should not merely be viewed as a checkbox. While it is necessary for some of those important things like meeting funding requirements, it can be valuable for a whole bunch of other reasons. Therefore, evaluation is something that truly should be taken into account at every step of the program process, even right at the beginning when doing things like creating your logic model. So I am going to pass it over to Khadija, but before that, we are going to take a quick 5-minute body/mind break before going into the second part of this webinar. So we will reconvene at 12:28, so around 12:33, if my math is correct. So looking forward to having everyone come back, and I'll now give it to Khadijah.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I think we've lost our OASW people, but I hope that they'll be back with us shortly, and I guess we can start in the meantime. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Caroline, for that excellent introduction to and summary of program evaluation. I learned a lot about my job through your portion. And thank you to Lorraine, Anab, and Hannah for all of their work in putting this together. And now we can let the fun begin, or continue and speak about equity considerations and evaluation. So I will just share my screen. Just a second here. Oh, Anab, good, you're back.
Yeah.
We were just going to get started, and we wanted to start off with a little poll about equity, and that is to ask all of you, in your workplace, what do you perceive or imagine is the biggest barrier to incorporating equity considerations into your program design, administration, and/or evaluation?
You can just maybe close. We're going to proceed, and I'll just say we're unable.
Khadija, sorry, unfortunately, we're not able to launch the poll right now because of some technical issues. If we can just move forward without doing that.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so technical issues, and we will move forward. Although actually I'm seeing it up here right now.
Yeah, we've launched it. So folks can start answering the questions on the poll. Hopefully they can all see it.
Okay, wonderful. We're getting some answers in. So in terms of the barriers to incorporating equity into program design and evaluation and administration, seeing some answers here like awareness or knowledge, which I think is a big one. So lacking understanding of how to incorporate equity into these aspects of programming, fear or uncertainty about what will be uncovered. I think that would also be another big one. And then there's resources, so funding and time. We have a couple others, and so I'd be curious to know what those are, and maybe we can get to some of that in the Q&A. So we'll move on for now, but thank you everyone for contributing to that poll. Okay, so let us get to it. So what is equity in program evaluation? Equity in program evaluation is a response to the broader context of injustice that we live in, which by default informs our programs and our program evaluations. And so equity in program evaluation includes any and all efforts that we take to counteract inequity within the realm of program evaluation. So why should we integrate equity in evaluation? Good question. Firstly, to interrupt inequity. Like I mentioned just prior, inequity is the context that we live in. And so program evaluation, like everything, is inherently political, since we live in a world where power and privilege are distributed unevenly. And so equity in evaluation isn't about inserting politics into evaluation, but about recognizing that politics is already a part of evaluation, and therefore responding to this fact appropriately and responsibly. And so, to be clear, if we fail to do this, we are engaging in inequitable program evaluation. Secondly, we should integrate equity in evaluation to prioritize those who we're serving. So generally, the programs we are evaluating exist because of need, right? So food banks exist because of food insecurity, homeless shelters because of homelessness, etc. And this need is generally distributed along lines of race, gender, sexuality, ability, etc., with those marginalized by these factors more likely or more predisposed to need than those who are not. And so therefore, when we take an equitable approach to program evaluation, we are proportionately prioritizing service users, since the people and perspectives that are uplifted through the equity process are those same people and perspectives who most greatly benefit from our programming. Thirdly, equity enhances the quality of our evaluation because it results in uncovering perspectives that are normally marginalized. This broadens our understanding of reality, making sure that it best represents the actual diversity of reality. And then finally, we consider equity in evaluation in order to maximize our program evaluation efforts. So a key YouthREX philosophy is that program evaluation isn't just about proving the worth of our program, but improving our program. And so equity in program evaluation orients us critically, which then facilitates fact-finding and analysis that can improve the status quo of our programs. Okay, so where in evaluation is equity relevant? And yeah, you guessed it, everywhere. Since inequity exists everywhere, our interventions for equity must also be inserted into every stage of the evaluation process. And so we're going to move on to considerations and strategies for incorporating equity into every stage of the program evaluation process. But before we get to that, though, here is a concept that we use at YouthREX that can support you in conceptualizing and thus integrating equity into your evaluation. And that is by reimagining evaluation as a storytelling tool. So you can think of your program evaluation as a story about your program, right? Like any story, your evaluation has a beginning, and that would be a description of the need your program is responding to, whether that be hunger, homelessness, or mental unwellness, or anything else. Your story, like your evaluation, has a middle, and that being the description of your program, which you establish as an intervention to that identified need. So if the need is hunger, perhaps a food bank. If it's homelessness, perhaps a shelter. If it's mental health difficulties, a therapy group, etc. And then there is the end to your story, and that is whether and to what extent your program effectively responded to that need. So that is the basics of how program evaluation is like a story. But the key part of this analogy, one that's helpful towards orienting us towards equity, is that like any story, program evaluation isn't just the truth about your program, but a product of the lens through which you're viewing that truth. So like this image on my right, your left, I don't know how these things work, but like this image, the image is taken in relation to the storytelling involved in news media, but it applies to this as well, right? So as always in the world, there are a million things happening, but what we choose to focus on and how we choose to make sense of that thing reflect the authors or the news media's decision about what's important and what isn't, and how different things relate to one another. And so you could say news media, just like program evaluation, it tells us the truth, but it's never the only truth or necessarily the most representative truth. It's a particular truth. And so similarly, the same is true for program evaluation. It's that it's a selection of truth and a particular curation of truth. And so by understanding program evaluation as storytelling, we can recognize its political nature and as such, the need to integrate equity concerns into all stages of it. Okay, so let's examine equity at all stages of the story. So beginning the story, equity in program design. Like we've discussed before, our programs all develop in response to a need that we've identified. And how we conceptualize this need and then how we determine the solutions to this conceptualized need is political. And therefore, equity considerations are relevant within our program design. So to help illustrate this, let's use an example. For example, the background context being that there are high rates of reported violence among youth in a particular city, in the GTA, for example. One option for making sense of this issue and defining the issue is to say that there's youth violence in the city because, well, youth are violent. And by defining the problem in this particular way, certain options present themselves as solutions, right? So if we say that youth violence exists because youth are violent, our program might be to increase police presence in the neighborhood to deter violence and penalize perpetrators. Alternatively, though, we could recognize that higher rates of violence among a particular group of youths is not attributable to problematic individuals, but rather a problematic context, specifically poverty, lack of access to recreation, employment opportunities, post-secondary racism, lack of political power, and the stresses of racism and classism. And within this framing, increased police presence is clearly not the solution, right? Higher rates of reported violence is itself a function of excessive police presence. And nonetheless, penalizing violence perpetration doesn't really address the root causes that we've identified. And so in this alternative, our program in response might be an after-school program, which includes tutoring, post-secondary information sessions, recreation, food, social justice education, referrals to services and to material resources. So here we have an example of how the same problem can yield different solutions in terms of program design, based on how we've decided to make sense of that problem, and specifically based on whether we've adopted a critical equity perspective or not. And by the way, in case it wasn't clear, this second one is the equity-informed option. So that is equity in program design via a simple example. So to continue the story, once we have developed a program, the next stage in the evaluation process is to collect the data that will allow us to assess it. Our strategies for collecting data about our program reflect our ideas about authority, right? So whose opinions and what forms of knowledge matter. And thus what is considered appropriate and accurate in terms of understanding the effectiveness of our intervention. And in turn, our ideas about authority, and thus who is an appropriate source for data collection, our ideas about authority reflect power and privilege. And as such, data collection is an important site for equity considerations. So to illustrate this, let's return to our example about the violence prevention program and how we would go about conceptualizing how to collect data in order to evaluate the program's success. So here's a list of questions that we generally ask ourselves, either overtly or implicitly, when deciding upon our data collection strategies. And it's helpful to break down these questions and consider the equity response to each of them. So firstly, who are we asking in our data collection? Are we asking the participants themselves about their perceptions of the program and its effectiveness? And if not, why? Too often, we make the assumption that those who need a program are inherently needy, and thus, in some sense, incapable or incompetent. But if we recognize that lived experience is an important form of knowledge, and if we recognize that suffering under oppression has nothing to do with individual neediness, but rather a context that systematically produces need, then we have no reason to discount the opinions and knowledges of program participants. Conversely, if we are relying on other non-program participants, we have to also consider their limitations and not take for granted the received authority of them. So, for example, we know from statistics that racism manifests in the school system, with teachers more likely to categorize Black, Indigenous, and racialized students as problems. So if we're asking teachers about their opinions on the effectiveness of this violence prevention program, what kind of biases might we be introducing into our data collection? So who are we asking? And reconsidering based on our received biases, who's considered authoritative and who's not. Secondly, what types of data are considered reliable? So we tend to assume that quantitative or numerical data is inherently more objective and trustworthy than qualitative data because, you know, as the old saying goes, numbers don't lie. But for example, what if we were to measure the effectiveness of a violence prevention program based exclusively on statistics of law enforcement interactions? Because we know statistically that law enforcement is biased in terms of race and class, in that poor, Black, Indigenous, and racialized individuals are more likely to be intercepted by the police for not having done anything wrong. And so in this case, numbers do actually lie, or at least they don't tell us the truth that we think that they should, since reductions in violence wouldn't necessarily translate into fewer interactions with law enforcement. And so this sort of gets us to reconsider the inherent authority we vest in quantitative versus qualitative. Thirdly, who is doing the asking? We tend to think of a program evaluator as a sort of objective third party, right? I mean, that is literally their role, is to evaluate something from an external perspective. But when we're interviewing people as part of our data collection, the interview facilitator is themselves an active participant in the knowledge production process. And the interview is only as effective as the relationship of trust between the interviewer and the interviewee, as well as the interviewer's insight and ability to ask the right questions. And so this fact calls upon us to consider the social location and other subjectivity aspects of the interviewer themselves, right? So how their lived experience, their race, their class, abilities, sexuality, gender, formal education, etc., how all of that informs the interview process. And importantly, when we're considering this social location and subjectivity of the interviewer, it doesn't necessarily translate that the more formally educated, the better, because we recognize that trust isn't a function of formal education, and lived experience can't be measured in years in post-secondary school, right? And so again, we are questioning the way that we distribute authority by recognizing that who is doing the asking is important, and that important or that their authority and effectiveness at interviewing isn't a function of the normal metrics by which we assess authority. Fourthly, how are we doing the asking? So for example, YouthREX recently created a resource that describes the problems with the way we ask about gender on our demographic forms. And we showed how the common options available for participants to describe their gender reflect normalized transphobia, cisnormativity, and racism. And thus how people who are trans or non-binary or two-spirit often don't have a way of describing themselves accurately on these forms. If we don't make the right options available to people to describe their gender or any aspect of themselves, then we are generating false data. And so the gender question is one example, but it speaks or provides an example more broadly to how the questions we've asked determine the extent of accuracy that is available to us. And specifically, if we're not asking the right questions, we cannot possibly be getting the right answers. Fifthly, I don't know if we're allowed to say fifthly, I don't think that's a thing, but fifthly, what do we want to know? So for example, what are we interested in knowing? Is it, for example, if youth are causing fewer problems for adults in their community through this violence prevention program? Or alternatively, is our question, do youth have the knowledge and skills to make decisions in their own best interest? The first question prioritizes compliance and conformity as the ideals or the aspirations of a violence prevention program, while the latter prioritizes individual and collective empowerment. And so depending on what we're interested in, we'll ask different questions and we'll yield different results and get a different sense of the quality and effectiveness of our program. And then finally, whose time is considered important in the data collection process? It isn't always considered standard to offer honorariums to participants who do interviews or otherwise participate in the program evaluation process. And this reflects a common idea that if you are a participant of a program, your time is less valuable than the staff who are compensated for their participation. And it also reflects this idea we have that participants should be grateful and passive recipients of a program and thus not expect anything in return for contributing to program improvement. But if we recognize that people contributing to an evaluation help us to do our job better, then we also have to recognize that we are indebted to them for their participation. So those are some questions to ask yourself when trying to design your data collection strategies with equity in mind. Okay, and now ending the story, equity and data interpretation, how we analyze and contextualize the data we've collected to give our program evaluation a coherent narrative about its effectiveness. So as we mentioned before, our programs exist within a broader context and they shape that context. How we make sense of our program in relation to this broader context is political, and therefore data interpretation is an important site for equity considerations. So there are actually some common tensions and paradoxes that are important for us to consider when we're trying to make sense of our data. The first is that the worse the broader context is, the more successful our program has the opportunity to be. So like, for example, the more hunger there is, the more numbers we'll be able to report at our food bank. And the more hunger there is and the fewer food banks there are, the more very satisfied we'll receive on our food bank reviews, since people don't have other options. So basically, our intervention of good is gooder or better when the context is worse. And in the context of increasing inequality and government austerity, our program successes are a direct reflection of context failure. Secondly, short-term outcomes don't necessarily foretell long-term outcomes. So food banks address immediate hunger, but as food activists have noted, they can actually undermine the quest for long-term food security because they ease slightly the sting of inequality and so make poverty more sustainable in the long run. Like spraying Febreze on a garbage can of rotten food. Conversely, activism for adequate minimum wage, activism for food sovereignty, and other measures might actually have zero short-term outcomes in terms of reducing hunger, because we know the arc of progress is long, but those activities are more likely to yield long-term outcomes in terms of creating actual food security. And so the short and long-term outcomes can be misaligned and actually even contradict one another. Thirdly, a third tension is that numbers served can contradict people served. And that by this, I mean that serving the most doesn't always mean serving the best. In fact, small and customized programming, particularly for minority marginalized groups who benefit from that exclusive space, that small customized programming might be more beneficial precisely because they are serving fewer people. And so, again, similarly, the quantity served doesn't necessarily represent or reflect or can even contradict the quality served. And finally, the people we serve are in need, but that doesn't make them needy. And that is when any group of people is experiencing worse outcomes, that never reflects on their individual deficiency, but rather a deficient society. And recognizing this is important because it's through blurring this distinction between individual and societal deficit that we can actually undermine the competencies and the agency, and thus the humanity actually, of the very people that we're seeking to support. And so how do we account for these tensions and paradoxes within our data interpretation? So on the first one, the idea that the worse is the broader context, the more successful is our programming. We can account for this by providing sufficient context, context that would suggest that our food banks are themselves insufficient and that change beyond them is required. In fact, change that would make our program irrelevant since the root problem would be addressed. And so we should ask ourselves, in our program evaluation report or debrief or whatever it is, or in our analysis, we should ask ourselves, are we making the case for justice or are we just making the case for our own program? And of course, it's not that we don't want to make the case for our program, but we also have to strike that appropriate balance between making such a case and not undermining or negating the need for broader justice that would make our program irrelevant. On short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes and their contradictory nature, we can account for this by attending to both short and long-term outcomes in our program evaluation, recognizing that they provide different things and that both are important and that one doesn't necessarily flow from the other and therefore require separate attentions. And this is actually a common concern within like the normal process of program evaluation, because a common assumption that we make in program evaluation is that if we have short-term outcomes, and those are what we're measuring in our program evaluation, that we don't need to measure long-term outcomes because they will necessarily follow from our program intervention. And it's not that this not that this is never the case, but I think it's still important to provide individual attention to both the short-term and the long-term and recognizing the tensions and contradictions in them. On the question of numbers served contradicting people served, we can account for this by using metrics outside of numbers to assess effectiveness, right? And, you know, in terms of measuring satisfaction or testimonials, these all provide context or surrounding information to our numbers served to sort of flesh out how our program is doing beyond the mere numbers of it. And then lastly, the people we serve are in need, but that doesn't make them needy. Okay, so those World Vision or whatnot commercials that show poor racialized children dressed poorly and crying with weepy music basically don't do that. So while we generally aren't so gauche in the way that we represent our programs and evaluation, we do have to watch out for reproducing that narrative in more subtle means. And we can be conscious of not doing this by constantly centering the agency and competencies of our participants, as well as centering their entitlement to justice and the fact that this entitlement has not yet been met. Okay, and finally, sharing the story, equity and knowledge mobilization. And so for those who don't know, knowledge mobilization includes all of the activities and efforts that we make to disseminate the findings of our program evaluation. Our priorities and strategies for knowledge mobilization reflect our ideas about who is entitled to justice, reflect our ideas about who is entitled to know and what are appropriate ways for data to be shared. And this in turn reflects power and privilege, and as such, knowledge mobilization is a site for equity considerations. So we have to consider a common tension that surfaces at the knowledge mobilization stage. And that is that the groups of people with the responsibility, ability, and power to fund a program are generally not the same groups of people who access, benefit from, or are otherwise directly impacted by a program. And here I don't just mean that they're different, like literally different people, but also that they tend to diverge in terms of life circumstance and identity characteristics like occupation, income, race, class, immigrant status, geography, etc. The funders of a program and the people who are directly impacted by a program are different, and in addition, often have different and even contradictory interests in the knowledge mobilization process. So to look at some of these, what are some of these different priorities? So in terms of why we share with these various groups, for participants in the broader community, we share for accountability reasons so that they can assess the value of the program as well as provide ideas for the future, for future such programs, and inspire broader action and change on the issues. Conversely, for funders, we also share for accountability reasons, but this is primarily financial accountability, since a condition of receiving funding, as many of you would know, is reporting back on the outcomes of the program evaluation. And we also share with funders so that they'll recognize the worth of our program and continue to invest in it. On the second question, what do these various groups want to know? So participants and the broader community, generally speaking, want to know if the program is worthwhile, and hence whether they should continue supporting it as an intervention in their community. They also want to know how the program can do a better job of responding to their needs and how the evaluation will be used to do so. And they want to know how they can transplant those lessons from the evaluation to inspire further change. Funders also want to know if the program was successful, but from a different perspective. They want to make sure that the funding was used as per the terms of the agreement. They want to know that the numbers that were served is proportionate in their mind to the funding that was given out. And they want to know if the outcomes were or could be interpreted as impressive to the broader public. So in other words, both participants and funders want to know if the program works for them, with definitions of what works for them overlapping, but also divergent. And what do they want out of the evaluation? Participants in the broader community ultimately want analysis and resources that will fuel systemic improvement in their communities. Funders, on the other hand, want evidence that they, as the funder, are funding proven positive change. Again, these are overlapping but not entirely shared interests, specifically because participants want the kind of long-term improvement that would make the program that we're talking about irrelevant, right? So they want a food bank that will be doing the systemic change that would make food banks irrelevant, right? While funders are less concerned with that systemic improvement and more so in capturing and relaying their own personal contributions. And finally, how do these various groups want the information shared? In ways that are responsive to their that are responsive to their particular needs. And this is in a multitude of ways, depending on their location, right? So their age, their formal education, their familiarity with program evaluation jargon, etc. In other words, whatever way makes sense to them, and that's different. Whereas funders generally have a standard template for submitting evaluations that tend to focus on numbers and quantitative measures and refer to evaluation language and terminology. So we generally and understandably prioritize the needs of funders in the knowledge mobilization process. But this can be problematic because it perpetuates the idea that the beneficiaries of a program are meant to be passive recipients. They should just be grateful to accept its fruits without demanding accountability, while those who are financing it are entitled to dictate its terms. But if we recognize the context of systemic injustice, a context that means that certain people have their needs systematically unmet, then we recognize that our programming is an incomplete attempt to compensate for the misdistribution of power and resources. And as such, that our programming isn't a gift, but an entitlement, and that participants are also entitled to demand accountability for how their program unfolds. And so it's up to us to find ways to meet our knowledge mobilization obligations, not just to our funders, but to all stakeholders. Okay, so those who weren't listening are in luck, because here's a summary about equity in evaluation. Equity in evaluation is relevant wherever inequity is the default, aka everywhere. Equity is not about favoring certain people, but about equalizing their contributions to and benefits from the evaluation process. Equity doesn't undermine the quality of an evaluation. It actually strengthens it by expanding our understanding of reality to be fully representative of its diversity. And equity is not about kindness, it's about fairness. It's about correcting for a context of systemic injustice, wherein certain people and perspectives are systematically neglected and denied. And while we've given you some considerations and strategies for adopting an equity approach in your evaluation, the truth is that equity can't be inserted by template. It demands constant attention and responsiveness to the conditions of the people that we're working with. And so, in other words, don't blame us if nothing we have said works here at all. And that's it. Thank you. And with that, I'll pass it back to Caroline and OASW to do a wrap up, or however else we are planning to move into the Q&A.
Awesome. That was really powerful and amazing. Thanks so much, Khadija. I'm just going to switch over and share my screen now, just to wrap up with some resources to help you all with your continued learning. So if you do want to learn more about, some of the resources we talked about in our actual webinar here today, or just even outside of it, I'm going to direct you to these resources because you can find a ton of information to help support that learning. First one is our toolkit, and I actually linked this in the Q&A. So if you go to the Answered tab, you should see the link for it, but it's also here on the screen. So our toolkit provides you with those evaluation specific resources that are tailored to where your organization currently is in your evaluation journey. So it's organized based upon that framework that I presented earlier in the first part of this webinar. So if you remember, the one that had the 3 different stages, 7 steps. So you'll find resources for each one of those steps and each one of those stages. It's very, very helpful. So I do recommend checking that out. Next one is our Knowledge Hub, which I did touch upon again at the very beginning, but just as a reminder, our Knowledge Hub is a database that's chock full of evaluation and non-evaluation specific resources, including those evidence-based reports, infographics, templates, you name it, it's likely there. And finally, if you're looking for more of that customized evaluation support, you can contact our youth program support, aka Khadija, and we will assist you from there. So without further ado, we thank you all so much for being here today. It was a really exciting opportunity to collaborate with you all and to talk a little bit about evaluation and some of these more important considerations around evaluation. So with that, we'll now open the floor up to any questions or comments, I guess. And here is our contact, our email, and website for YouthREX. And yeah, I guess I'll hand it over to Anub if you want to.
Thank you, Caroline. And thank you, Khadija, for such an informative webinar. So folks, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function and please ask your questions so I can tell them so they can provide answers. Okay, so we do have some questions. So there is a question in regards to what happens in a scenario where participants feel very grateful for the program. So in the evaluation, they tend to be over generous in their answers. Do you guys have any kind of commentary in regards to that?
Caroline, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe just if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's like they're answering that everything is great out of fear maybe that it will come back on them, or that yeah, maybe if there's a little bit more context to the question. I think I know what it's asking, but.
So from what I'm gathering is the individual is asking that the participants of evaluation will be over generous in their answers because they feel grateful for the program they've been provided. If the person that asked that question could provide more context, I would be very much appreciated.
I actually think that's a really good point. And what they've brought up is a common concern. You know, when we're talking about equity and evaluation as increasing the quality and the veracity of our evaluation, this is one of those important considerations, which is that in a context of systemic injustice, wherein marginalized people have been taught against their entitlements and as such feel excessive gratitude for an attempt at redistribution, that excessive gratitude does exist. And so I think that is a concern, and it's one that we have to account for. In the section, I think, on data analysis, you know, by providing appropriate context to systemic injustice, I think we can allude to the inadequacy fundamentally of our programs, and how despite the gratitude of our participants, that we haven't achieved or overcome the root issue that it exists in response to. I think that's one way to compensate for that, and definitely it's something that we should be aware of. And like, I guess on a practical level, that also calls upon us to make sure participants know that their feedback is anonymous, and that like critical commentary is actually welcome by us. But yeah, thank you. I think that's like a really good question and an important consideration. Sorry, I don't know if they've yet provided more.
They haven't.
Maybe I can add on to that too. Just like add on to Khadijah's response too, especially when we're working with youth. We do have a tendency sometimes to see that, especially if you're using surveys, they might just circle all fives, loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it, loved it, right? So that's why I'm a huge advocate personally for more creative evaluation methods when working with younger populations. So thinking about art-based or movement-based evaluation methods. For instance, art-based could be a rotating mural. So if you have a program filled with youth participants, the rotating mural, essentially you have a giant piece of paper and you ask the youth to go up and draw how they felt about their participation in the program or what they liked about the program. And by the end of it, it's really cool. You have all of these images, and they can also add to each other's too. So they're building off of each other's thoughts. And it creates not only this really beautiful visual tool, but it's also data, right? Like that's data. And then you can also ask questions to youth, like, why did you draw that? Oh, why did the program make you feel like this way? Why were you happy? You drew a smiley face. So it opens up the floor for some more probing discussion around these things to really get to the root of why they so much like this program, right? So that would be my recommendation to help with that is, although surveys, of course, are very convenient and take less resources and time and energy from our half as the program developers or facilitators or evaluators, just thinking of youth themselves, you know, what would be the best way to capture their voices through the evaluation process and really dive deeper into that to help account for some of these things, you know, think outside the box sometimes, if that's, of course, if you have capacity. I also recognize that too.
Thank you. Thank you, Khadija and Caroline. So we do have another question. In terms of program development, what or where is the best way to look for funding grants? I don't know if you guys can provide this information, but if you can answer it, that would be great.
Yeah, I personally, I don't have like a specific area to point you all towards. I think that would just depend upon, you know, what area you're in, and kind of talking with more of those individuals within your own networks to find what those opportunities are. That would be my recommendation. But in terms of just like for evaluation overall, there aren't really any specific directions. It will be really context dependent. But I don't know, Khadija, if you have any insight.
Yeah, Carol, that's pretty much what I was going to say. Like I think one option for trying to look for what you're looking for is to like think about the sector or the approach that your desired program is in and search accordingly. So there are a lot of grants that are like specifically for arts-based initiatives or ones that are specifically to serve the mental health needs of racialized youth, for example. And so if you know the population and the approach that you're going with, you can search more specifically for grants that are interested in that. But yeah, beyond that, there's so much that's out there and so much that's available. And I think, like Caroline said, especially talking with people in your network, that's probably one of the best ways to go about it.
Thank you. So we have another question. How do we increase awareness on expectations of funders to balance out the mobilizing of data analysis tensions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really tricky one, actually. And I think, you know, my answer to these questions is normally smash the heteropatriarchal settler colonial state, which is not particularly satisfying. But what I mean by that is that the investment in the status quo is really deeply embedded in the infrastructure of the state, right? And so like funders, whether they be government or private investment or private funders, have an interest inherently in making their funding contribution particularly worthwhile. And like was mentioned in the section on tensions, is that an initiative is more worthwhile the worse things are in the world, right? And so I think maybe the answer is beyond the walls of funders, right? And advocating outside of programming interventions for systemic change, right? And so I think it's important, like, for example, you know, to return to food banks, that if that's a program that we're involved in, to also be participating in food security activism, right? And so maybe we don't rely on funders to address those tensions, but we balance out our own efforts to include concern for short-term and long-term outcomes. I don't know if Caroline, like, you have more experience in advocating with funders.
Well, I think you capture that perfectly.
Thank you so much. So another question is, in regards to the challenges folks may face when integrating equity in their program evaluation, can you guys provide an example that you guys may have experienced?
Sorry, Anab, sorry, you said what's a particular issue that we've encountered in integrating equity?
Yes, an example you guys can provide so people can have an example to look at.
Caroline, do you want to?
Sure, I can provide like a not like a super in-depth one, but just something that we see sometimes, like accessibility of the questions that we're asking, like the language around it is sometimes a barrier. Again, I'm talking all about with youth just because I work in the youth sector in this space. So this is just based upon, you know, my reflections. And I found that sometimes, even when we're working with specific populations within youth, individuals who may possess intellectual disability, or newcomer youth where English is not their first language, like trying to find ways to still get those questions across to them. And there are ways to do it. Again, you can use some creative methods. Like there's one activity called Color by Question, and it's an activity where you have youth color specific images based upon yes or no questions. And so color this baseball bat red if your answer is yes to this question, or color it blue if it's no. And again, it's a little bit more of an inclusive activity to still get those questions across to the youth, but then they're able to provide those responses and they're able to understand what you're asking of them, which is really important. So I think that that's important to keep in mind too, exactly, again, who you're working with and like who you're asking this question to when you're going throughout that data collection process or the evaluation process overall, and trying to meet your methods to what their needs are. So that's just one example I can think of.
Kara, I think that's a really good example. And I think what it reflects is the point that I was about to make, which is that that's about equity in program evaluation. But as the example illustrates, equity in program evaluation is about accuracy in program evaluation. If people don't understand the questions you're asking them and aren't able to answer them, then your program evaluation will be inaccurate. So even while we're framing this discussion as one of equity in program evaluation, I think a more effective or helpful framing is to think about accuracy and effectiveness in evaluation, right? Because if we are not integrating equity, then if we haven't made those considerations, then our evaluation is less than. I think Caroline's example is really good in that regard. So thank you.
Thank you. So we do have another question. Do you have any tips or preferred methodologies for accurately surveying the identities of clients in a large-scale program? For example, the racial, ethnic, sexual, gender, educational levels, income levels. For example, in regards to, I'm going to provide some context to this question, like they're having issues in regards to delivering these questions verbally because some staff are becoming resistant asking these questions, but also clients are not sometimes having reactions to these questions.
So one thing I'll say about that before I pass it to Caroline is that I think it is important for us to consider why we want to know what we want to know. In general, collecting information about clients is onerous, like you mentioned, like time consuming and a hassle. And it's also invasive, right? It's gathering data on a community. And we should remember that people who can afford services in the for-profit market, whether groceries or therapy, are rarely asked to provide that level of detail of information about themselves. And so that's actually it's a class-based burden that falls upon people who access nonprofit programming to describe themselves in such detail. But that said, and I saw this was another question, so I think it sort of works together. There's a question about how to ask about gender. So YouthREX actually developed a toolkit and a fact sheet and had a webinar on the subject in which we provide what we consider to be a more inclusive menu, one that is exhaustive in terms of the range of gender identities. And so that is available on our YouthREX website. And we are also developing other fact sheets. So we do have some of those really specific answers to those questions about how to ask these questions. But I think an important consideration always is, why do you want to know? What are you going to do with that information? And I think generally we ask a lot of information that we don't really need the answer to, or that we're not planning to make actionable in any way.
Thank you.
Yeah, and like that's exactly what I was going to say too, like being very intentional behind the data that you're collecting. Like I think sometimes evaluation is so like process focused that it's okay, we'll just repurpose this demographic questionnaire that we use for every single program and we'll just have our participants fill it out. But if that information will never be used for anything, or it's not relevant for what you actually want to look at regarding your intended objectives or outcomes of your program, then putting that additional burden on your participants, is it really that necessary? So I fully agree with Khadija, like be very intentional about what you're gathering and why, and make sure it's things that are actually going to be used for whatever it is that you're looking for.
Great point. So in regards to that, just to add on to that question, when we're integrating equity into our program evaluations, asking those type of questions, does it help with, are they always necessary for us to have equity, to increase equity? If we ask those types of questions, are they necessary? Or like Khadija said, you just have to think about why you're gathering that data and why it's important.
Caroline, did
No,
Yeah,
no,
go ahead.
yeah, no, I share the same thoughts, that like just being very intentional, like the why question, like why are we gathering this? But I'll let you add on if you have anything.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like Caroline said, that is sort of the central consideration. But so if we are being intentional in how we're gathering data, we have to have thought beforehand how we're actually going to apply the knowledge generated from that data, right? So if we do find that our program isn't being accessed, for example, in the racial composition that we expected to, and that particularly non-white people aren't accessing it in the way we want, we can, and these are like 3 areas that we've identified as being like possible analysis to come out of that is our program safe? Is it accessible? And is it relevant to people across a range of like across the demographic range, right? So safety, accessibility, and relevance are 3 areas that can be uncovered by looking at the demographical composition relative of your participants, right? But yeah, I mean, if you haven't already intended to do that, then or if you didn't have a way of applying that information, then you should be considering why you're collecting it.
Thank you both. So it seems like we don't have any questions left, and we are soon, the webinar is going to be ending soon. So I just want to say we are receiving messages of appreciation for your such informative webinar. Thank you for joining us today. And I also like to thank our participants for joining us today. Thank you. It was amazing. It was great. And one line I will remember from this webinar is equity is not about kindness, it's about fairness. And I hope folks remember that too. And with that, goodbye, and hope you guys all have a great day.